it is. History on tap at the Cantilever, 9th of May, 2025. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Mike Williams. I'm president of your Historical Society. And the two young ladies to my left here are Ashley Levine. She's our executive director. And then we have Corey Horton, the assistant executive director. Our subject this evening, thank you, is the history of commercial fishing on our area lakes. But before I begin, I would like to thank the Cantilever for hosting this event. It's our 4th event this year. I'd also like to thank Jeff McCard for the sound system, and Darcy Sullivan, who's up in the gallery filming this evening. And a special thanks to the staff at Voyageurs National Park for their assistance in the research for this event. But most of all, I want to thank all of you for attending. We do this for you. Without you, it wouldn't happen. Like I said, our subject this evening is the history of commercial fishing, primarily on Rainy Lake, Lake Kaptogama, Namakan Lake, and Sandpoint Lake. We'll deal mostly on the Minnesota side, but operators on the Ontario side will also be included. The very first reference that I could find about commercial fishing on Rainy Lake occurred in 1898 with the Armstrong Fish Company that began netting in the Bears Pass area. They were harvesting sturgeon at that time for their roe and were using pond nets. Now a pond net, or pound net, sometimes pronounced pond net, is basically a large fishing trap. We do have a drawing over here on the display board of what they look like. But in simple terms, a long barrier net was tied to shore, which would force fish to follow it into the pond part of the net through a small opening. I would imagine that some of the fish inside would figure their way out to escape, but most would remain trapped. The advantage of this type of net is that fish would remain alive and unwanted ones could be released. Also, sturgeon grow to great lengths and widths and are much larger than the gill nets of those days could handle, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. The disadvantage of pond nets is the pilings had to be set on a soft bottom in relatively shallow water. They were labor intensive to construct and required at least 2 men to lift. But after the roe was removed from the sturgeon, it was run through a series of sieves and then salted, placed in barrels, and then was ready to ship. Now shipping in 1898 was not easy. It could be shipped one of 2 ways: across the portage at Kettle Falls and up to Harding on Crane Lake, loaded onto a cart on the way to Lake Vermilion, and then on a railroad to Duluth and the Great Lakes. The other way was to Fort Francis and down the Rainy River to Lake of the Woods, onto Rat Portage, which is now called Kenora. And it was not until, and the railroad, it was not until 1901 that Fort Francis was serviced by a railway. But this particular caviar from the Bears Pass area was much prized in Europe. The Armstrong Fish Company operated until 1904. Commercial fishing then became very quiet around here, but not for long. A big change was in the works, and it began in 1907. Ashley?
So like Mike was talking about with those different modes of transportation, one that I kind of want to talk about just for a second is what was considered the tower route. And so that was if you were moving materials, fish, people from Namakan Lake in the eastern end of Rainy over the portage of Kettle Falls, those fish were being hauled to Duluth by way of this route. And it not only involved boat and rail, but also freight wagons. So the Crane Lake, or from Crane Lake, there's a portage that is roughly 27 miles, and that would be traversed via this freight wagon or a stagecoach to Lake Vermilion. And then from Lake Vermilion, once it gets on the lake, it's taken by a steamer where then it eventually meets up with the railroad. So all of this fish or whatever supplies is having to go on a very long journey. The railroad there would then transport everything to Duluth. Now this route was opened in 1890, and this was a major way for people and equipment, whatever, to be transported back and forth from Koochiching Village and Rainy Lake City to Duluth. Now, in 1907, well, actually, it's a little bit earlier than that. The third route is what transpires, and that, of course, is the railroad coming. The Canadian Northern Railway arrived in Fort Frances in 1901, and then the Duluth, Rainy Lake, and Winnipeg Railroad arrives and reaches Rainier. That happens in 1907, and then, of course, we have the first passenger train that crosses in 1908. And then the Minnesota and International Railroad comes to International Falls in 1907, but that really had nothing to do so much with commercial fishing as it did with the mill being here. But it made commercial fishing a lot easier. It was more convenient, it was more economical, and it made the transportation of fish a lot safer because they were able to keep it iced, and you're not having to worry about re-icing it as often because there were ice stations that were placed en route along the railroad. Not only that, but refrigerated cars are already invented by this time. They're not obviously automatic refrigerated cars, those come much later, but they're refrigerated cars in the sense that they were well insulated and they could hold that ice for a long period. Dan McCarthy, who was a major fish buyer in the area, he ended up shipping from all 3 points. He would ship out of Rainier, he would ship out of International Falls, and he would ship out of Fort Frances, just depending on the markets and the different people that he was dealing with. However, the same year that the railroads came to the American side of Rainy Lake in 1907, there were 2 gentlemen that arrived that would really change commercial fishing and bring in the small business part of it, and that is Adolph Hilke and his brother-in-law Arthur Schmidt. And they arrived from Wisconsin in the spring of 1908, and they started commercially fishing on Rainy Lake, and so that was really the real advent of small-scale family fishing on Rainy Lake.
And I will be talking about one of those gentlemen, Adolf Ferdinand Hilke. So Adolf Hilke was born in Berlin, Germany, August 28th, 1870. He immigrated to the U.S. with his family, which would have been his widowed mother, his sister, and 3 brothers, when he was 15 years old. They settled first in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and they lived there for 12 years. But one day, Hilke and his brothers took a little rowboat and they started going down the Mississippi, and they came to Stockholm, Wisconsin, and Hilke thought that that place was pretty nice, so later on he went back and moved to Stockholm, Wisconsin, and on Lake Pepin he did commercial fishing there for 2 seasons. While he was there in Stockholm, he met his future wife, Matilda Pauline Feldhausen. She was from Missouri, and they were later married in Minneapolis in November of 1899. And so while the couple were living in Minneapolis, Hilke was a streetcar conductor, which is a far cry from commercial fishing. And I don't think he liked it very much because he was back in Stockholm the next year commercial fishing again. So commercial fishing, I think, was what he enjoyed. He was in Stockholm doing the commercial fishing until 1908. But flashback to 1905, he had gone on a little scouting trip to this area because he was thinking there's got to be, better places or better opportunities somewhere else. So he comes up here in 1905 and he scopes the place out, and the dam for the mill would have been under construction at that time. So I would have to imagine that he probably saw this place as a blossoming community. It was developing. There was E.W. Backus, putting money into this area, and there wasn't that many commercial fishermen on the American side of Rainy Lake. So flash forward back again to 1908, he gets all of his stuff in order, and him, his wife, their kids, and then his brother-in-law and his family, they all move up to Koochiching in March of 1908. When they first got here, they could not find a hotel. So in 1908, there would have been a couple of hotels, but most people were staying in the home at that time, working on stuff. So they weren't able to find a hotel room, but there was a stranger that kindly gave up his room for the women and children, so they had a bed to sleep in for the night. And the men, they went and camped on the riverbank for the night. The next day, they hit the ground running. So they got with Ed Eck. He was the captain of the Dan Patch, and they boated up to Rainier. And from Rainier, Hilke caught a ride with John Erickson, and they went up the lake, and he started scouting for a spot that he wanted to make his home base for his commercial fishing operation, and he settled at Kettle Falls on a place called Rabbit Island. Supposedly, it's called Rabbit Island because of Adolf Hilke. He apparently had a bunch of meat rabbits, domesticated rabbits, and they broke loose. And you know how rabbits are. They overran the island very quickly, and it became known as Rabbit Island. So that was in the spring of 1908. He also made a note that first night, he spent the first night out on the lake after he found the spot that he wanted to be. It was kind of scary. He said it was really loud. It was so loud because there was a lot of moose, and they were eating all the lily pads in the area, and he said he didn't sleep at all. In 1909, he took over a Canadian commercial fishing project on the Canadian side of Rainy Lake, but he dropped that in 1910 and focused on his own business that he had on the American side. And Adolf Hilke was known as the first commercial fisherman on the American side of Rainy Lake. And so he stuck to that, and he operated in the Brule Narrows after Kettle Falls. He built a fish house, an ice house, and a normal house in the Brule Narrows to stay during the fishing season. He bought some property with his wife in Rainier, and they had a home there as well, but most of his time was spent at the fish camp. They would mostly do sturgeon for the roe, so it could be turned into caviar. He had his own boat, so he was able to ship his own fish for a few years at least, until there were specific people whose whole business was transporting fish from fish camps to the railroad. So he had the ocean wave that he used for a couple years, but then other people picked that up. He shipped out of Rainier and Kettle Falls. There was a spot in Kettle Falls that he would take the fish to. And the only day he said that he would take a full break during fishing season was the 4th of July. His kids, in some of their oral histories, noted that that was the only day that they would go into town and they didn't have to think about fish. For 2 years, through 1924 through 1926, his wife and himself, but mostly his wife, operated the International Bakery that was downtown in International Falls. It would be where Shannon Square is now. But that was it was a short-lived bakery because fishing won out. It was very labor-intensive. He was very active in the community when he wasn't out doing his commercial fishing. He was a member of the Oddfellows and the Loyal Order of the Moose. And him and his wife had 3 children, Mamie, Ferdinand, Adolf, and William. And he died May 20th, 1949.
For those who attended our very first show, The Rise of Rainier, we talked a little bit about Dan McCarthy, and we're going to talk about him again. But this time we're going to talk about him in commercial fishing, and we did not talk about that last time, so thank God you're not going to hear the same thing twice. When Dan came to the Rainy Lake region, he was already heavily involved in the commercial fishing industry. He came from Seattle as a fish buying representative, and he liked it so much that he decided, he liked it here so much that he decided that he was going to stay. So he joined up with H.W. Keyes in between 1916 and 1917. They became partners in what was known as the Lakeside Fish Company. And from that point on, he gradually started purchasing shares in that company until he became the controlling majority. And by 1921, he had bought out the entire company, so then he owned it fully. And then, of course, it operated simply as DJ McCarthy's Commercial Fish Company. And he had that until the mid-1960s. There was another competitive fish buyer in the business in Rainier at the time that Dan was purchasing this Lakeside Fish Company. And this person owned Larson Fisheries Company, and this was a gentleman named Franz Larson. And he was known in the area as the longtime operator for the Rainier Fish Hatchery. And he had that hatchery until 1919, the state of Minnesota came in and decided that they were going to take it over from the commercial fishermen. And then the state ran it from 1919 until 1943, and then it was, they had it somewhere else in the mid-70s. But Franz basically operated his commercial fishing business from 1918 to 1926. So Dan had him as a competitor, and then he also had Fred Lessard for a brief period of time in the mid-1930s. And then on the Canadian side, he had another contemporary. His name was A.M. Spike Struve. He was the president and manager of the Fort Francis Fish Company, and that started in 1916. And they had a really great relationship. Spike and Dan corresponded regularly, and they supported each other in all of their endeavors, in their respective countries, especially lobbying for commercial fishing. One of the issues that arose in 1910 was there were fishermen like Adolf Hilke and William Randolph and Neil Berger. These are all American citizens, and they maintained both American and Canadian fishing licenses for commercial fishing. And one day, the Canadian government in 1910 decided that the Canadian fish are for Canadians and the American fish are for the Americans. Tell that to the fish. And so this caused some problems for some of those guys. So Randolph, he decided that he was going to opt to maintain just an American license. However, Neil Berger, he chose to continue living. He lived on the Canadian side. He maintained a Canadian license. And then Adolf, who had been fishing both, he had to make the choice, and he chose to have an American license. Well, this kind of was upsetting to Dan. He thought that was crazy. And over time, he decided, by 1926, why it took him 16 years to make that decision, but maybe that lobbying takes a while. He decided that he wanted to advocate for a treaty between the U.S. and Canada for joint control over fishing, and not just commercial fishing, but also with sports fishing as well. And this is because obviously we have Rainy Lake is considered international waters. So in May of 1926, he had written a letter to Senator Henrik Shipstead urging the U.S. to take a real interest and try to negotiate this treaty because it's important and it's negatively affecting commercial fishermen in the area. And despite the fact that there was a lot of interest and there was support and they did sympathize and understand, unfortunately, I guess they didn't care enough because a treaty never did materialize. Another issue that Dan was combating was the battle between sports fishermen and commercial fishermen. These associations firmly believed that commercial fishermen were taking too many of the game fish, particularly walleye, out of the lakes. And this was a battle that was going on like time immemorial since commercial fishing started. Sports fishermen had this belief that the fish were only in the lake for them to catch, and that was kind of it. And of course, that wasn't obviously how commercial fishermen felt. In 1933, the state did start to regulate the fish buyers. So people like Dan, they were required to keep records of all of the people that they were buying from, how many fish, what the price was, and then they were also subject to inspections of their premises by the Minnesota Game and Fish Department. Dan wasn't a super fan of that, but obviously he had to comply, and I don't really think that there should have been a problem with that, but I suppose government and small business, he didn't want to have to deal with it. Dan didn't just ship fish, though. He was a friend to a lot of these commercial fishermen. He was supplying them with high-quality equipment. People could go to him for nets and tools. He was friends with a lot of these big-name company dealers, like the Howard K. Balch Company of Milwaukee. He consulted with Howard on the ins and outs of the fishing industry, making sure that his people on Rainy Lake were getting the best materials that they could possibly have access to, but also have it for a fair price. Most of these materials, of course, are coming from other states like Michigan or New Jersey, but the one thing that Dan made sure that he wanted to keep consistent that was local were the fish boxes. So we have a fish box sitting over there, one of the wooden fish boxes. That's a pine wood fish box from Dan McCarthy's fishing company. They were either made by the fishermen themselves or they were made in Canada. They were made either by Lockhart Sawmill or later Myers Lumber Company, both of Fort Frances. That one was made in Canada. Dan was regarded by one observer as synonymous not only with the commercial fishing industry in the area, but also with the prosperity of an era. He definitely fostered a lot of growth in the entire community. You had a really growing, successful community from, the early 1920s up until the 50s. You had, a booming Rainier Industries. You had stuff happening in International Falls, and Dan was a part of all of that. Dan retired in 1966, and Bowdoin Fisheries of Bayfield, Wisconsin became his successor, and they operated on Rainy Lake until '76. And then Dan's son, Jim, his youngest son, opened the Rainy Lake International Wild Rice and Fish Company, but then he later kind of cut that down to just being Rainy Lake International. And that was located in Bowdoin's former building that they had in International Falls rather than operating out of Rainier. And Jim operated that processing plant until July of 1985.
The next person you'll hear about should sound a little bit familiar if you were at our Women in the Wild show, because we talked about this gentleman's better half, Lydia Torrey. So her husband, Emil Torrey, was another commercial fisherman in the area, except he fished Namakin Lake. Emil Torrey was a Finnish immigrant. He was born September 15th in 1895 in what is now Russia. It was Finland still when he was born, but they ceded politics. It's Russia now. His father, Anton, made a living captaining vessels that would go back and forth between St. Petersburg, Finland, and England. So he kind of had sailor in his blood. He was loved being on the water. He grew up around it. His mother, Regina, was a home nurse who passed away while he was a child, but that's important to his future development. And when he was a child, Emil would go around and he would be with his father, and who would be on these ships, and he was around his mother, who was a nurse. And by 1915, Emil was already off on his own, working on merchant vessels, so sailing around the world. He navigated through the Panama Canal. He went to Japan. He went to Seattle, all in the early 1900s. But then in World War I, when the war broke out, he decided to take up a job on a hospital ship for Britain in the British Navy. So kind of a tie back to his mother's career as a nurse. So during World War I, he was on these hospital ships going back and forth between India and England, taking care of wounded soldiers. Under circumstances he never fully described to anybody, he was severely injured on one of these hospital ships. And by severely, I mean he should, by all accounts, have been dead because half of his head was blown off. It was a medical mystery that he even survived. And at the time, the common fix for these types of injuries was silver mesh to reconstruct the skull. So Emil Torrey, half of his skull was made of silver because during World War I, he was severely injured on one of these ships during some type of commotion. And after he was recovered and they rebuilt his skull, he kind of just went back to being a sailor. In 1919, after the war was over, he was awarded the Mercantile Marine Medal and the British Medal by the British government. The Mercantile Marine Medal was specifically made to present to merchant sailors that were sailing during World War I. So he was on hospital ships and running goods. He kept sailing until 1921 when he found himself in Ray. So he went from being blown up in World War I to settling down in Ray, Minnesota. So in 1924, at 28, he started leasing Kubo Island on Namakin Lake, and he started commercial fishing. And his camp that he had used to belong to Frank and Mike Bowman that they had established back in 1910. So at the same time that Emil's getting started commercial fishing in the area, unbeknownst to him, his future wife's sisters have immigrated and are in Fort Frances, and their sister Lydia, who was newly single, she was divorced, which was rare for the time, and she was looking for a new husband, and they knew of this eligible bachelor who was a commercial fisherman on Namakin Lake, and they told Lydia to, quote, write a little note to this old man. Except Lydia was 4 years older than Emil, so they wrote back and forth for about a year, and Emil invited her to come visit him on Namakan Lake, and Lydia fell in love with the area. It reminded her of home, and when Emil asked her to marry him and take up this life as a commercial fisherwoman, she said, sure, why not? And they made Kubo Island their home. Emil and Lydia, they fished for whitefish, jackfish, walleye, and tulabi. They would fish in the summer. They had their own ice house, and they would harvest ice in the winter to pack it and preserve their fish. Emil would typically take his fish to Gapis Landing or Kettle Falls, and from there they would be transported elsewhere. On their time during this, their life here on Kubo Island together, Emil was kind of known as a jack of all trades or a quote-unquote Renaissance man. Lydia was quoted saying, he isn't much for anything, but he tries everything. So he had his hand in everything. He was an amateur musician. He would do all sorts of stuff, and he was madly in love with his wife. So if she wanted something, he would either make it for her or he'd find a way to get it out to Namakan Island. She even had an organ that he skidded across the ice so she could have an organ to play at their home. And one of Lydia's favorite musical instruments was a little lyre that he had made for her. And to show his resourcefulness, it was made out of the remains of a ship that blew up on the lake. It was the first closed cabin inboard boat that was on Namakan Lake. And something happened with the gas, a lot of fumes, something ignited it, and the ship just blew up. Everyone survived, though, because the survivors were able to swim to shore, and they ended up staying the night at Emil and Lydia's cabin. And they used the groceries that had got blown out of the ship to cook them dinner, because it was blown so far that the groceries landed on their island. And so did pieces of the ship itself, and Emil was just like, this is good wood. This is mahogany. And so he made an instrument out of it, and that was Lydia's prized possession. He was known as a quote-unquote roly-poly Finnish man. He was very happy, very jolly, and everyone around knew and liked him. But unfortunately, in October of 1954, he was going on a normal run to drop off fish at Gapis Landing, and he didn't come back. That was October 4th, and for 5 weeks, his wife had no idea what had happened to him. She assumed the worst, and unfortunately, she was correct. He had drowned. There was an accident. The weather wasn't great that day. He fell overboard and drowned. Through research, I did learn, though, that a lot of these commercial fishermen did not know how to swim. That was apparently not a prerequisite for fishing on the lake. But Emil was already in poor health in the few years leading up to this accident, so all things considered, he just wasn't able to get out of the water. But they didn't find his body for another 5 weeks. They found his boat the day after his accident, but his body wasn't found until a random fisherman found it floating in the lake, and they were able to recover him, and he's interred in the cemetery in International Falls. And that was Emil Torrey, and Lydia continued to live on the island for a long time all by herself.
Thank you, Corey. I'm going to talk about the Danny, or the fish boat as we called it. I'm going to talk about fishermen, commercial fishermen that I knew, including Art Langford, Herb Williams, Eddie Sobleski, Lauren Erickson, Harry Ovison, and Alan and Elton Kilcheski. I'm going to talk briefly about the annual ice harvest, and I'm going to talk about the conflict between hook and line fishermen and commercial fishermen, and the eventual buyout. But the Danny, or the fish boat as we called it, was owned by the D.J. McCarthy Fish Company in Rainier, Minnesota. Its purpose from 1940 until 1968 was to boat supplies to the commercial fishermen on the south arm of Rainy Lake, and on this return trip, bring the commercially caught fish to be processed at McCarthy's Fish House, right over here in Rainier on the other side of the tracks. Early boat captains were Fred and Herb Williams, Paul Kilcheski, and the one that I remember best, Lauren Erickson. Early, every Sunday and Thursday morning, from mid-May to late October, the Danny would leave Rainier for Kettle Falls with many, many stops in between. Arriving just before dinner at the Kettle Falls dock, it would be unloaded and the numerous supplies that were ordered by the hotel would be dropped off. That included mail, passengers, fuel, beer and pop, groceries, whatever. But then Lauren, after dinner, would unload his small boat and go look for Indian artifacts or arrows, as he would put it. He did this, as long as I knew him, when I was at Kettle Falls, from the summers beginning in '57 up to 1967. He was always put up in room 12 in the hotel by my grandma when the hotel was open. And then he'd stay with Herb and Mabel Williams when the hotel was closed in the fall. But then early on Monday and Friday mornings, the Danny would be loaded with fish boxes from the Namakan and Sandpoint fishermen, and then return to Rainier with the same stops as on the way up. This lifeline on the lake came to an end when a new boat captain on the Danny hit the reef just west of Smith Island and was severely damaged. Towed to Rainier, was placed in dry dock right over here until it was burned by unknown vandals. And this occurred during the summer of 1968, excuse me. Lauren Erickson left the employ of the McCarthy Fish Company in 1967, and with his young son Wayne, began commercial fishing on the east end of Rainy Lake. He also became a custodian at the Falls High School, and also was the Zamboni operator at the brand new Bronco Arena. The Erickson fishery closed in 1985. But the commercial fishery closest to Kettle Falls on the Canadian side was operated by the Langford family. Their fishing ground was Hale Bay. Barney Langford began fishing in the early 1920s with the help of his sons, but unfortunately he lost two in separate plane crashes. And at that time, 1954, his son Art moved from Fort Frances to the mouth of the Bear River where their fish camp was. Art was a bachelor, and he was a good man, but he had a weakness for alcohol. As a result, the nets were neglected, and the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources revoked his license in 1966. He then moved to a small house near the Canadian Dam. I spent a lot of time with Art until his passing in 1979. Other commercial fishermen near Kettle Falls on the Ontario side were the Kilcheski brothers, Elton and Alan. Their father, Frank Kilcheski, started on Rainy Lake near Friendly Passage in the early 1900s. His 5 sons were raised there, fishing, trapping, hunting. Eventually, just Elton and Alan remained, and Alan in 1967 moved to Namakan Lake with his family when he purchased the fishing grounds from Thora Berger. The Kilcheski families were bought out by the Canadian government in 1991 and ceased netting. Their island, that same island near Friendly Passage, still remains in the Kilcheski family. I often speak about the insatiable appetite that the dining room of the Kettle Falls had for fresh walleye. Even though we and our guests caught a lot of fish, it never seemed to be enough. Thankfully, the commercial fishermen in the area were able to help us out. Many times we would boat over to Lauren Erickson's fish camp and even as far as the Brule Narrows to buy fish. It got easier when I got my airplane in 1978, and I would fly to what at that time I called my go-to guy on the west side of the Brule, Eddie Sobleski. I would take 2 gunny sacks and a $100 bill and fly to find Ed. Sometimes he'd be at his camp and other times pulling nets in Saginaw Bay. I would land and buy 50 walleyes, which averaged 2 pounds apiece, at $1 a pound. Ed then was happy, and of course our customers at Kettle Falls were happy. I should add that I never did buy any fish from Harry Ovison because he had a contract, apparently, verbal, I would imagine, with both Rainy Lake Lodge and Island View Lodge to keep them supplied in fish. But of all the commercial fishermen I knew best and was closest to was Herb Williams. We were not related, but I looked to him as a second father. Herb and Mabel Williams lived in the White House on Anamican site at Kettle Falls. House is still there, of course. His main job was to operate the stop log operation on the 2 dams for the power companies. His fishing grounds were Junction Bay area of Namakan Lake, and for whitefish only. He also operated the portage rig between Namakan and Rainy, and of course hauled the fish boxes from the other fishermen that were Namakan-based over to McCarthy's fish boat. I would tag along with Herb when he was pulling and setting his nets, and I spent many weekends and vacation time with he and Mabel. He died suddenly and unexpectedly on the 16th of June, 1965, at the age of 56. Every amount of every single commercial fish operation required a large amount of ice to preserve their catch. It should be noted that it was an annual event with each and every one, and also should be noted that the ice harvest is the only harvest ever in this part of this country to never fail. Each fish house had an ice house 30 to 50 feet square with plenty of sawdust. As soon as the depth of ice on the lake reached the desired amount of 14 to 24 inches, neighboring fishermen and family and friends would gather and make preparations for what we called putting up the ice. The ice field would be shoveled free of snow. A ramp would be frozen between the field and the ice house. The field would be cut into a grid pattern with each cake, let's say 16 by 22 inches, and the cutting would either be done by hand or with a plow-type device, or as I've observed through the years, gasoline-powered circular saw. The cakes would be slid usually one at a time up and into the ice house. The cakes would be packed tightly together, but with an 8 or 10 inch gap from the ice house wall on all 4 sides. Each layer or tier of ice would be placed directly on top of the one below. Often 5 tiers were enough, but I've seen as many as 8. Then sawdust would be shoveled into the gap between all 4 walls and into the top of the ice at a depth of 12 inches or so. And if this was done properly, the ice would last all summer. The whole job would take 3 days, sometimes more. Then after, it was usually party time. But as our sport fishing been increasing in popularity, conflict began between hook and line fishermen and the commercial fish industry, as Ashley alluded to. Each were competing for the same fish, walleye mostly, and each blamed the other when success dropped off. But sport fishing had more clout, more support, more political backing, and it soon showed up here on our border waters. In 1924, no commercial fishing was allowed anymore in Koochiching County. 1926, Lake Kaptogama was closed to all commercial fishing. 1945, Namakan Lake was closed for walleyes on the Minnesota side. 1957, Sandpoint Lake followed suit. And then in 1985, the last 3 commercial fishermen on the Minnesota side of Rainy Lake were bought out by the state of Minnesota. 1991, the 2 remaining Ontario commercial fishermen on the south arm of Rainy were bought out. That was the Kulcheski fishery and the Kulikowski fishery. In July of 1985, Ed Sobleski, Harry Ovison, Lauren Erickson each agreed to accept $17,633.31 to cease netting. Now any net that you see on Rainy Lake either belongs to the only remaining commercial fisherman, Joe Arnold and his whitefish license, or possibly DNR test nets. However, if if any of you ever want to net whitefish, you can do it with a special season that happens every fall, but make sure that you follow all the intricate rules from the state of Minnesota. But in closing, the argument persists whether or not commercial fishing is harmful to a lake. On one hand, it removes the valuable game fish, but on the other hand, it removes unwanted or rough fish that compete and even feed upon game fish. But now we'll never know. However, we do know that at one time or another, 127 individuals held commercial fishing licenses on our area lakes. 127. They provided a valuable service to our consumers, plus they made a living for their families. I now could take any questions from anybody, but if not, I have a few more stories to tell. Pat? But what he says is there's a fish box over here, a 90-pound box, and 60 pounds of fish would be put in it, and then 30 pounds of shaved ice.
And then when it got to rain here, they had to redo the ice. And when they shipped it, they put new ice in the box. It used to go out on box cars right out of Rainier.
Yeah. Yeah, Pat says that it would be re-iced here in Rainier, and I think it was re-weighed to make sure that the fisherman weight was correct.
And Dan McCarthy tried to get the fish in the market as fresh as he could.
Well, it was
He delivered a good product, that's why he got the money.
yeah. Yeah, it was very necessary for McCarthy to get the fish to market. I mean, as far as Kansas City, and I think even New York, but it had to show up fresh. But is anybody familiar with the old car that's abandoned on the small island in Little Brule Narrows? Some of you are? No. But years ago, I asked an old friend, Frank Johnson, who had a cabin on Big Island, if he knew anything about that old car that was on the little island. And he said I should call Manny Herzig. Now, Manny just passed away just a week or so ago. So Manny told me that in the late 1950s, he converted the family station wagon, a Studebaker, into a pickup truck. Then in 1960, he sold the Studebaker as it was no longer needed to John Kulikowski, who had a commercial fishery on the east side of the Brule Narrows, for $1. John, of course, was a commercial fisherman, and he needed the car to assist him when he did his annual ice harvest. The horse that he used for years had unfortunately died. But it was late in the winter when Manny and his friends set out to deliver the car to John, but they found too much snow in the Lost Bay Portage, so they drove around the west end of the Brule Narrows to attempt a safe passage through to John's house. Everything was going well until the engine blew out on the car. All the men could do was to push it to the nearest little island, and we're at rest today. The idea was someday to replace the engine, but it never happened. In the meantime, through the years, it was scavenged for parts by people unknown, but there's not much left of it now, but it does raise a lot of questions from people who are fishing close by and see it. So. But another thing I should mention is setting and pulling a gill net can be dangerous and even deadly if man is doing it all by himself. In the late 1950s, Frank Kilcheski, grandson of the original Frank Kilcheski, drowned in Harris Lake, just north of Rainy Lake. Apparently he got tangled in his own net and was pulled out of his boat. And as Corey mentioned, transporting fish to market is also not without risk. Emil Torrey, on a very rough day, drowned in Lake Kaptogama on the 4th of October, 1964, while delivering his catch to Gapa's Landing. So I'd like to talk a little bit about my old friend, Art Langford at Kettle Falls. Late one evening, Art and a guest were still in the bar at closing time And Art talked the guest, into going along with him to set a net. Now, Art did not have a commercial lift license at that time. It was late May and late at night, and they had way too much to drink. Plus, I told Art that the suckers were really running thick, and it would be silly to put a net in. But they decided to go anyway, so I decided to go along with them so nobody would drown. This we did, and all went well. At 5 in the morning, I was to wake up the guest to get him to see the net being pulled. But I couldn't wake him up, couldn't get him out of bed, so I boated over to Art's house, over by the Canadian Dam, in a very dense fog. But fog is good when you're up to no good. However, about a half a mile square of below the Canadian Dam, there was no fog. We started pulling the net. It was full of fish from one end to the other, suckers. About halfway through the lift, I could hear an airplane coming close. Then it landed and probably ended up about 100 feet from us with 4 or 5 people aboard. Obviously, the pilot was looking for any safe place to land until the fog lifted. But Art and I could do nothing other than to continue lifting the net. Now remember, there was no license. The entire time we had the plane load of people watching us. We got the net in and the fish up in Art's dock, over 40 suckers, 2 walleyes. So I left Art to do the work of removing the fish from the net. I guess it took him a long time because suckers, just the way that they're built, they're really hard to untangle from a gill net. I fully expected a phone call from the authorities on that one, but nothing happened. Either the people thought or did not care, or they thought, as brazen as we were, that we must be legal. That's all I could figure. But I do have one more story about Art, and we do have time. This is when he had a commercial license, so I'm probably 1965. But he had a sturgeon net, and he had it set between the 2 dams up at Kettle Falls, right in the spot where you can almost see both of them. But he talked a Kettle Falls regular, Morris Bartholomew from Iowa, into going out to watch him pull in this sturgeon net. Now Morris watched things pretty close, and I don't know if any of you have ever pulled in a net that would have a large fish in it, but you can feel a tug. Of course, Morris didn't know this was going on. So Art bet, like I said earlier, he liked to have a drink. So he bet Morris a drink that he had a sturgeon coming up. Morris took the bet. Obviously, Art knew what he was doing, and pretty soon a sturgeon, not a big one, came in. So he bet Morris again, second time. Obviously, a second sturgeon came up. Then a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, and each time Morris thought he was going to get out of the bet. Apparently they had a deal, if there was no fish, the bet was over. Art ended up with 7. All 7 were too small to keep. So not only did Art get suckers in his net, he even had one in the boat with him.
Thank you.